Now, next up today, we have Mychal Denzel Smith, Stakes is High, Life After the American Dream. And we have Paula Farmer introducing him today. Paula is our chair of inclusion and diversity, and she's the chair of it in our committee. And she has a new Instagram live series that I'm going to link today, featuring a brief but powerful weekly interview with authors, artists, and activists with a focus on diversity on paulafarmer.com. I'll link that in the link, but thanks so much. Oh, Paula, you're on mute.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. And welcome, Mychal. So nice to have you here. I was telling Mychal earlier, I got the honor of hosting him when his first book came out, Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching, which is still one of my favorite nonfiction books, and I highly recommend as much as I recommend his new book, Stakes is High. So welcome back to the Bay Area, virtually speaking. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me. I wish I was out there for real, but these COVID times, this is the next best thing, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations on the new book. And yeah, love the timing of it too as well. Um, I want to just kind of take people back to your first book, which came out in 2016, Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching. To me, it was a very unique observation of how you and your peers, specifically Black men, young Black men, were kind of navigating a world in which, on one hand, you had the murder of Trayvon Martin and others, and then you had Barack Obama, candidate and then president. And what a weird dichotomy that was. And you kind of weaved in humor as well as just contemporary issues and historical. And I think you kind of do a little bit of that without the humor this time, I will say. So you've grown up and become cynical, and who can blame you given what's happened in the world? For Stakes is High, you do talk a lot about the American dream, um, or American exceptionalism. Can you kind of broadly, to start, tell us what you see as the American dream, as far as what you're saying for the sake of the book and your conversation, and how do we obtain it if we can?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, this book is less funny, isn't it? And it's it has to do with it reflects sort of the mood that I was in, and a mood that a lot of us were in post 2016 election, mood a lot of us may be still in now. And I wanted to tackle the idea of, or in the process of writing, it became clear to me that part of what I was sort of interrogating was the idea of the American dream. And obviously I'm not the first person to do that, right? Like this has been a topic for many a writer, many a thinker. But what I wanted to get at is like the ways in which that is tied up in and influences the American identity, and how it prevents us from seeing and then directly addressing the flaws within this country, and the way it prevents us, a lot of us, from hearing when someone's critiquing us, critiquing the way that the country's built, the way that it's structured. Mm-hmm. And so, we think of the American dream, and I think everyone has their own personal relationship to it and their own personal definition. But in the broadest sense of what the American dream is, I think it's the sense that in the United States of America, by virtue of the principles that it's built on, everyone has the opportunity to go from nothing to something, or to everything that they want, right? You can achieve here. You have opportunity here to live out your wildest dreams of what you want to be and what you want to have in your life. in a material sense, in a like a spiritual sense in a way, right? The pursuit of happiness, right? All of that. I think we have to deal with the falsehoods of it on two levels. One, that in actuality, the people who are achieving the American dream start out with all of the resources that one would need in order to do that, right? So your access to that ability to dream and fathom a life is determined by your zip code, and therefore determined by what school you have access to, whether or not you have hospitals that care for you, whether or not you are policed in particular ways, whether or not you have just running water, clean running water, right?
Yeah.
So most people who start out on that nothing end of the spectrum do not make it past that. Like there are obviously some, right? And we like to uphold those stories. We like to tell those stories over and over again about these people who achieved by the dent of their own ingenuity, their own wits, their own desire, and all of that. But that's a select few out of many. So that sense, the American dream is false for all of us. We don't all have access to it. But then in this,
Most of us don't have access.
Most of us, right? Like
right. A lot of people are starting, not a lot, but an elite are starting out, like if it's a race, they got a way head start.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And then people who claim to be self-made, it's classic, like Donald Trump. I'm a self-made millionaire. No, your father gave you like $500 million. That's not the same thing.
Right, and his father also built that wealth by exploiting low-income people in New York City, right? And like by building slums, right? So you have to identify what the source of it is, right? And that brings me to the point. Is just to say what the American dream then constructs in that telling of it. You can go from nothing to something, is to say that it's somehow okay, somehow moral, that anyone start with nothing, that any person be without, and that it's somehow their fault if they don't then achieve, that they don't move through the sort of the idea of like climbing up the ladder of the socioeconomic ladder, to say that you don't that you have failed in a moral sense if you yourself do not move out of that position. But why is anyone in that position in the first place, particularly in a place of such abundance, right? Like there's so much wealth, and the people creating that wealth, as I said, like going back to sort of the example of Donald Trump, right? The people who are actually creating the wealth, the people who are laboring for the construction of all this wealth, are not seeing the benefits of it. Their wealth, the wealth of their labor is being extracted from them and serving in the hands of a few, the elite. They are like the capitalist class, who is then saying that no, we made it all on our own, and when really what they did is just owned the labor of other people. And so I think, and so then in examining the American dream and in this book is to say, why do we accept that that's a position that anyone should be in? And I think that we have told ourselves over and over this story of opportunity that again is false, but then that idea reinforces itself in this sort of heroism, in that like we are, by virtue of being Americans, exceptional. We are heroes of our own story, like in the world story, and therefore everyone needs to fall in line with that version of the story. And to disrupt that story would be to then call into question the entirety of the American identity.
Yeah, yeah. But it's almost like, now that you're saying it, I'm realizing we've grown up with that concept of the American dream and America's so great and everybody has a shot at it, when for so many it's not true. But like you said, it's almost like you feel guilty if you're not perpetuating what for many of us is actually a lie.
Yeah. Yeah, there's guilt attached to that, absolutely. To the idea that you're that your position within a society that's hierarchical is dependent upon someone else's deprivation, right? So you
Yeah.
have to deny that it is in order to not be eaten away by that guilt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate your chapter titles. They're very concise,
Mm.
pointed, and almost searing. It's freedom, justice, delusion.
Mhm.
Which can we touch on delusion
Yeah.
and accountability? I want to talk about those two in particular. Um, it's a delusion. You point out that people of the United States have rarely been actually united.
Mhm.
And how does that, would you agree that is especially true in recent years? Or is it more of a cyclical thing where maybe we kind of come together around some ideals or hope, and then we come back to this because it's like we're back here of the abundant need for Black Lives Matter movement and other organizations rallying against inequity.
Yeah, I think in trying to explore that, what I want to get at is in response to these sort of movements, right, where you have a Black Lives Matter, you have people in the streets, you have people rallying to say the injustice and stuff. You have then a response where people are saying we have to come together as a country. There's disunity now in response to this, and it seems like every sort of moment of like anything that's uncomfortable for those who are interested in the maintenance of the status quo is then a signal that there is disunity, right?
Mhm.
In that moment. What I want to say is that, the disunity, those fissures already exist. It's that you experience these moments in which they come to the fore and they are uncomfortable for people who would rather ignore them. So it's not that the police station is burned in Minneapolis in response to the killing of George Floyd, and that's the moment of disunity. It's the centuries of policing that is this signal that we have been
Yeah.
that there's been no unity, that there's been an imposition of you know police violence on particular communities, Black communities, more recently especially like Muslim communities, right? Like that's always existed. That's been the disunity, only you're just now seeing the results of that. And so like the examples that I use in the book, one of them is like thinking about Stonewall, right?
Yeah.
It's not that suddenly we had this moment in which especially Black trans women and then also other queer folks were asserting that they've been mistreated that one night. It's accumulation of laws and mistreatment and violence for decades, for centuries, that then result in this moment. So you can't point to that single moment of the brick being thrown, even if it's a sort of mythological construction of that particular brick, and say, oh, well, we weren't having an issue with like sexuality before then. We were all sort of united. No, you were having a denial that folks existed. And then even in recognition that other sexual identities or gender identities existed, what they experienced was violence. And so we have to just discard the idea that there's a national unity that then gets disrupted by these different movements or these different actions. We have to deal with the fact that by the nature of our structures, because of the ideologies that undergird everything, all of our institutions, the disunity is already there. If we're working toward unity, if that's a goal, then we have to deal with the ways in which we've been segregated from one another on the basis of various identities and the pursuit of power for particular peoples.
Well, it's kind of like it's a symptom of a deeply rooted wound.
Mhm.
And so now it's finally gotten to the point where it's erupting, and it's like, yeah, we all have to do something about it because the symptom has been building and building and building.
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's not a moment, it's a movement. And the reason why it's a movement is because it's taken so long to get to this
Exactly.
point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's true. And later on in the book, at least later on in my mind, following my questions, you bring up something that Malcolm X said, that only people with claim to the American ideal are those who can enjoy the privilege.
Mm.
And you were adopting that for yourself. And it is true. It's a very succinct way of putting it, and kind of what we touched on earlier.
Yeah, but also I wanted to sort of complicate that a bit, right? Like I think that there's a sense that because of my experience of America as a subjugated person, right?
Mhm.
I do feel like there's some distance between me and the American ideal, and like obviously, right? Like there's very real distance there. But I am also a product of America,
Oh, okay.
right? Like I'm not like I was born here, right? Like my people were brought here, right? Like they were enslaved here. But not even just that particular experience. I went to school here, so I did learn. I did had an American education, right? Like I, someone asked recently in a different event, they were like, I didn't read Audre Lorde until like after school or something. Were you assigned Audre Lorde? I was like, no, I wasn't. Like,
No,
it's an impossibility in an American education, right?
yeah.
And it's to say, like, no, I'm a product of those lies as well. And so the this book, Invisible Man Got the Whole World Wide, both all of my work is sort of an undoing of that particular education. It's an interrogation of the things that I've been taught, the perspectives that I've been taught to value,
Yeah.
and say, why have I believed this? What does it serve in my life? What does it serve us politically? What is it done to shape our identity and our relationship to the country, and then to this country's then political standing globally, to think about how we are citizens of an empire. What does that mean for us, where we stand, right? And what our relationship to that is, and our relationship to the benefits of being an empire, because we are all experiencing them, even those of us subjugated by America. So I just want to complicate our relationship to it, because I think thinking through those things then helps us to situate where we need to be politically in order to combat all of those ideas. Like if I acknowledge that I am a citizen of empire, then I have to ask the question, am I okay with being a citizen of empire?
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not, if I find that reprehensible, then what do I stand for?
Yeah, no, and that is an excellent point that you bring up, that at the same time, we and other Blacks and other people of color are kind of oppressed by the system. We are also a product of it
Mm-hmm.
because we've been indoctrinated. We don't have a separate education.
Right. Right.
We're not learning. Unfortunately, at that time, at least when I was growing up, Toni Morrison was not part of the canon,
Mm-hmm.
but Faulkner and his racism were, so it does make a difference. Excellent point. I'm glad you're mixing it up and making it complicated. And I think it's interesting the way you're wording it, because I just saw a clip of, not to, I know, go from highbrow to lowbrow, but to quote Chris Rock.
I love it. Let's go.
Chris Rock, I guess, who just hosted SNL, he said, we all have to rethink our relationship with government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way that's what your book is saying. Let's rethink our relationship with government and education and policy and politics.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think, in that first point, rethinking our relationship to government. You know, I think we default, and we because again we're just sort of like accepting the delusions, accepting the lies that we've told, the narrative that's been repeated over and over again. America is a democracy, right? America's not a democracy, right? Like it's far, it fails in its own sort of metrics of what a democracy are, like historically and in the present, right? Like a democracy cannot be denying people the right to vote, but we are actively, this country is actively trying to deny people the right to vote. My first question, if anyone who says, you know, America's a democracy, I'm like, how many colonies is a democracy allowed to have? Because we have Puerto Rico and Guam and American Samoa, right? Like, so you're claiming to be a democracy by and also denying other people their democratic right to govern themselves, right? You can't be a democracy and do those things, but we say it over and over again, we are a democracy. So if we are a democracy, if we're supposed to be a democracy, we have to rethink what that means for us, right? As the demos, as the people, what does it mean for us to be a part of a democracy? What do we want a democracy to look like? Does it look like 50%, not even that, participation in the voting system every 4 years, right? Like, is that democracy? Is that what we want? Is it a system in which we have not constitutionally, but like for the most part, sort of culturally, handed over so much power to the president of the United States, and then the body that's supposed to, like, by virtue of the Constitution, be representative of us, and is like toothless, has no power whatsoever, or acts as if it has no power. Are we okay as a democracy with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court of the, like, are we, and for people that we don't get to vote for, right? Like, are we okay with these things in our relationship to the idea of democracy and the way governance actually shows up in our lives? But the problem is that, again, we don't, and this is almost by design. I mean, I shouldn't say almost, it is by design that we don't have time for the most part in our day-to-day lives to think through that. What are most of us doing? Working, trying to pay bills, trying to put food on the table, trying to care for family, trying to raise children, trying to care for elderly folks, trying to care for sick folks, trying to just like, and at the end of all of that, what do you want to do? Do you want to be, again, like going out to a school board meeting, a city council meeting? All, like, no, you don't really want to. You want to chill. You want Netflix. You want to turn on your stories. You, like, that's what you want, right? And it's understandable. But then we have to ask the question again, as you point out, what does our relationship to government need to be in order to take care of those needs, right? In order so that we don't have to work in such a way to be able to afford healthcare, to have healthcare, right? Like, just you work so that you can have healthcare. You do a job that is pointless or meaningless to you, to everyone, in order to just have access to healthcare, right? So that and then you choose where you live, if you can choose where you live, on the basis of trying to get your children a good education, right? Like, why do some zip codes have better education than other zip codes, right? Like, those are big questions that we have that relate back to our own relationship to the way that we govern ourselves, but we're not governing ourselves because we don't have democracy.
Right. I mean, and good point. And I think these questions are coming to the forefront because of COVID, shutdown, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. It's like we have been kind of a captured audience.
Yeah.
But the key is, whatever happens on November 3rd, we have to keep that pressure on. We have to
Absolutely.
keep reassessing our relationship with government and how we want it to work for us. I like how you bring up the things about, do we want the president to have so much power? Or if we're going to continue to let a president have so much power, maybe it takes more to be one. maybe have more than just two criteria. It can be more than just two things, but an Invisible Man, you definitely, I think, very definitely weave in not only humor, but you talk about like contemporary issues in the broader context of history. And I think you also do that with Stakes. Um, and an example of that for me was with the chapter on accountability.
Mm.
And how timely is that in terms of the people, some of the people you bring up in that chapter, Woody Allen, Bill Cosby,
Mm-hmm.
Harvey Weinstein.
Mm-hmm.
But not only accountability they have to take on one way or the other through laws, persecution, but us as a society. And I thought it got really complex when you were discussing Bill Cosby,
Mm-hmm.
not to society at all in whole, but also specifically to the Black community and the reaction and everything. So I thought maybe you could dip into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I was dealing with Cosby because I wanted to relate the idea of like the delusions. Well, out throughout, I'm sort of talking about the American myth, right? Like the myth
Mhm.
making and the way that we create that, the way you tell stories. And Bill Cosby did that with the Cosby Show, right? Like it's to the point that do you think of Bill Cosby and Heathcliff Huxtable as different people? For most people, no, right? Like it's the thing that we are most immediately recognize him as, and like that when we're looking at the Cosby Show, like we're not even sure if we're seeing like Heathcliff Huxtable, we're seeing Bill Cosby, right? Like those two ideas are melded together, and it's deliberate. Cosby wants us to see him as America's dad. He is trying to construct an image of Black fatherhood that's supposed to be mainstream, that's supposed to be acceptable, that's supposed to be praised, in direct conflict with racist ideas around like Black fathers and Black family, right? Like he's trying to do that. But in doing that, he sets it up so that Bill Cosby's violent, reprehensible behavior is seen as unfathomable because of the construction of that myth, because we can't separate the idea of the good father that we see on screen committing such heinous acts, right? And so I wanted to do that for us to sort of get to thinking about like how that's reflective of like the nation as a whole. Like you're like, no, that can't be America. Like America's like the good, like whatever. But then to think through what does it mean that someone could be engaged in that sort of myth making and be committing such horrible acts of violence against people? Where does that come from, right? And I think it's convenient to just look at Bill Cosby, right, and just to be like, he is a monster. Well, yes, what he did was vile. He is absolutely abhorrent and violent, and I mean, it's sickening, right? Like the number of women subjected to the sexual violence that he inflicted on them, like it's sickening. But Bill Cosby is not, it's not just Bill Cosby, right? And so we can then rattle off all of these other names. So are we just saying that each of these people is themselves just a monster, like that they, right? Like, and then even if we broaden that out though, and we looked at the sort of justifications that then are given for their behavior, right? We can see that those things are playing out to lesser degrees, maybe less violent degrees, but like in our rhetoric or like in the ways that we talk, like, I mean, if we bring it back to Trump for a second, right? Like after that Entertainment Tonight video or the came out, it was like, that's locker room talk. If we can justify, if any number of us can justify that sort of rhetoric by saying that it's locker room talk, that means that a lot of us have heard that before, right? We've heard it within a particular context, and we think that it's okay in some context. We've accepted it as a part of a culture, right? So it's not a stretch then that if that type of talk is taking place in those locker rooms, that the number of people hearing it not speaking up then are getting the idea that those things are okay. Right? That they have rights to other people's bodies, that women don't have, are not autonomous beings that can determine who they want touching them at any given moment, right? Like that's a cultural thing. That's a messaging that's going out to all of us that that's okay. And so yes, Bill Cosby is, obviously an actor, a perpetrator of that violent, those violent messages, but the messaging is going out to all of us. So then you're creating a large pool of potential perpetrators, right? And so if we're thinking about accountability, we can't just think about what it means for Bill Cosby to be accountable for his actions, or Harvey Weinstein to be accountable, or R. Kelly to be accountable, or Woody Allen to be accountable, because these are high profile names. They're, we can adjudicate within the public and all of that. What about all of the nameless folks? I mean, not nameless in the sense of they don't have names, but like we don't know their names and they're experiencing this sort of violence daily. How are we dealing with the fact that, like, if we're saying that folks who do this are monsters, how many monsters are in our midst, right? Like, how many have been created? And I think that we're unwilling to deal with the idea that these monsters are cultural creations, because we don't want to have to change anything, because it does benefit, again, a ruling group of people. Cisgender hetero men benefit from this because they are then able to enact the form of socially acceptable violence on other folks.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like what you said. We were taught certain things and it was just burned in our brains. And same thing with certain sexual offenses, that it's just acceptable until it's not. It's like, no, it never was. It's just, it all came together. It's a system. It's a systemic problem, whether you're talking about sexuality, sexual abuses, racism, and all that. And I love how you bring it down to maybe certain names or certain examples, but it's in the context of a bigger picture that we all have to kind of look at and assess.
Yeah, I mean, we can't not do that because my question is always, it's about like, how committed are we to the addressing and eradicating and eliminating these behaviors, right? Like these things that we say are reprehensible, right? Okay, well, you send Bill Cosby out of prison. You send Harvey Weinstein out of prison. Problem's still not solved, right? Like you sent them away, you've shuttered them away, but the actual deeper like cultural and ideological violences that are at the root of what they did are still with us. And like for the change that has happened, like you do like learn now, no means no, right? But that doesn't take care of everything, right? Like it doesn't take care of still particularly young boys being taught that they do have the rights to other people's bodies, the particularly young girls, right? Like you say, you teach them no means no, but you also say that young boys, when they have crushes, they hit girls, right? Like you're setting a bunch of people up for a really violent future here, right? In which like young girls are learning that that love is expressed through violence, and those also young boys are learning that as well, and also never being challenged to tap into and express their emotions and say like, this is what I'm feeling. Like we don't pull boys aside when they hit a little girl and say, why did you do that? What are you trying to say? Why are you saying it in this way and not another way? We don't do that. And then we think that no means no is going to account for all of the failures that we have in the other lessons, right? Like it's just to say there's a complete overhaul, because you have to interrogate every aspect of the culture. And this is why in the book, a part of that chapter, accountability, what I looked at, and my editor was like, does this fit? Is this like weird, like that you shift to this? And it's just about, construction work happening in my neighborhood, and these signs up that say, men at work, right? And it seems like, this kind of innocuous thing, but just think about that. Like, is it necessary when you're tearing up the side of the road or the sidewalk, or to let me know that it's men doing this work? Is it necessary? No, it's not. But what it does is say men are doing something important. Their efforts take primacy here, and you're being conditioned to think of men as the ones that you pay deference to, that you move out of the way for, right? Like when they're doing work on the sidewalk, it says men at work. You got to go around that. You got to pay respect to what the men are doing. And this, also just the fact that it's so gendered, the work itself, that they can still have those men at work signs. They don't even have any women available to do the work, such that the sign would be necessary to change. And so now who has access to these jobs that are probably paying pretty well? And you're just setting up again this, this separation, this inequality.
Right. Wow. Always. It just permeates our society in the smallest to the biggest things. I want to bring in one other idea before we start bringing in some questions from the audience. You say that you are not writing this, or you didn't write this as an indictment on or intervention for the American dream, but rather a plea for community. Am I right in saying that might be the little bit of hope you're giving in this?
Yeah, I think that I was straddling two feelings during the duration of writing this book. Was feeling like I want to believe so badly in the possibility, but the reality just doesn't give me much hope, right? But I didn't want to end there, because then what is the point for me saying any of this, right? Like then it's just to say, like, then I'll just resign from it all and just be like, well, I'm a nihilist, and we'll just like it's all over. There's no point. I won't participate. If I'm going to participate, like I have to believe in some way, in some capacity, I have to believe there's a possibility. And so I'm like, where can I find it? And I do believe that especially this pandemic has taught us, at least from my observations, that we have to acknowledge the value of community, right? So especially in the beginning of this, what I saw was people jumping to and saying, okay, we have to shelter in place. We can't be with one another. That's going to leave some people out who can't go to the grocery store by themselves, or who are dependent on this service, that service, blah, blah, blah. And mutual aid networks shot up, and they say, okay, I'm a young, relatively healthy person. There's like elderly and sick and disabled folks who are at higher risk. I will go grocery shop for them. I will go get their medicine for them. And these networks are popping up, and then people are being cared for in that way. That's an example of just like community response to trauma, right? Well, one, we got a lot of trauma we got to respond to, but also we need to build that so that we're not just doing it in the event of trauma. That needs to be at the core of how we think about community, caring for one another. We are each other's responsibility. And so I wanted to end there and to be like, look, there's examples, there's ways that we've done this, there's ways that we're doing it. We can scale it up, we can like put it at the center of like our politics and the way we govern. We can do that. We have to believe it's possible first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm glad you ended where you were kind of wrapping up with a little bit of hope. And I think, like you said, it makes sense. It's either here it all is, bye, I'm out of here, or I'm going to stay in this with you and we're going to
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
So Valentina, do we have some questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. And it actually goes with that very easily. Somebody asked, kind of in those moments of those nihilistic moments where you're frustrated and at the end where you're trying to be positive or inspired or do work, what inspires you, or what books inspired you to work on these topics?
Well, as we all see, I just took a sip out of my glass. That's one thing. That is a response to that. I don't like encourage it as an unhealthy behavior. Anyone struggling with substance addiction, please do not follow what I just said. But I think it's that's I see the protest. I see the protest from this last summer, and like all of those folks getting out in the streets, all of those young people. I say that now because I'm in my mid 30s, and all of them are 20 years old, so they're young people to me now. But and I think people even younger than that. I think about like Sunrise Movement, right? Like teenagers who they're going to have to be the ones that like live through the damage that has been done to this earth, right? And they're like, we can't give up. And it's like, if they can't, then I have no room to be like, oh, well, fuck it, I check out, like if they're the ones out there fighting and believe that there's some possibility there, like I have no choice but to get on board with that.
We have a lot of folks that like your shirt. Their eyes were watching. I noticed that. How about some go-to authors as well?
Ugh, you're trying to get me in trouble and leave some people out. Like, I mean, read broadly, please. Like, don't limit to what I suggest, or like, there's stuff that I would say, the book, Stakes is High quotes a lot. Like I was pulling from a lot of different places in writing it. So there's everything. There's like Toni Morrison in there. There's Ralph Ellison. There's Herbert Marcuse. There's Hannah Arendt. There's Ling Ma. There's Morgan Parker. There's E.B. White. In the book, right? And those are just like things that made it into the book. There's Tressie McMillan Cottom, there's Kiese Lehman. I'm reading like Valeria Luiselli. I'm reading Layla Me. I'm reading Eula Biss and Claudia Rankine. And please don't limit yourself, but just read broadly, read expansively, and all of those authors will obviously have influences and things that you can then turn to.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. I think that's a good point to stop. We have a full Edelweiss link with our Discovery Lab list, and Stakes is High is on there on the second page. I double checked. And also Paula's website where you can check out that, what was it called? The Instagram Live series. Please check that out.